Welcome back into our next session here, as we're going to attempt to bring a close section 2 of Introduction to Theology, which is Theology and Philosophy. I want to go back immediately and pick up where we left off, and that was our second basic guideline. Please allow me to repeat it. I said that philosophy should be thought of primarily as an activity. Okay? In other words, that philosophizing, okay, is rather than as a body of truth. So philosophy, okay, is a tool. It's a tool. It's potentially capable of functioning from any perspective with any set of data. This is where I think we missed the boat, not understanding it. Now, granted, we talked about all of these different philosophical positions, right? We talked about this. We talked about pragmatism. We talked about existentialism. We talked about analytical philosophy. We talked about process philosophy. We talked about deconstruction, right? And not only are these vehicles and tools, but they're content unto themselves. But that's not how a Christian theologian or a preacher or pastor should use philosophy. Philosophy is the vehicle by which we take the content of theology, because to philosophize or philosophizing, okay, can work with any perceived and perspective and any kind of data that you want to convey. This is exactly what the Apostle Paul did. So hence, it's a tool. It's a tool that can be used by theology rather than philosophy using theology. Is theology using philosophy. So the form of philosophy, okay, the form of philosophy known as analytical philosophy, you remember that, okay, aims at doing what? What you remember what we were teaching on this? It aims at clarifying, okay? It aims at refining, okay? It aims at clarifying, refining the terms and the concepts and the arguments found in theology. Again, I'm going to repeat this. Okay. Analytical philosophy, okay, aims at clarifying, refining the terms, the concepts, and the arguments found in theology, not the other way around. So we're going to make use. What we're going to do is we're going to make use of this particular system, throughout the remainder, okay, of our teaching, and give it special attention later on, down the line when we get to section number 6, I believe. So further, the philosophy and the phenomenology provides us with a method of isolating experiences, okay, clarifying them, and thus determining their true nature. So this is what's going to help us to do that. And this is exactly what the Apostle Paul did in the book of Acts. Now, an example of the application of phenomenology, okay, is to be found in the investigation of nature, in the nature of religion, in the opening portion, okay, that we talked about, if you remember, way back when we first started this study. Okay? That was in section 1. Now, both of these can be useful to theology to the extent that they are descriptive and analytical. They are descriptive and analytical. Okay? They are not prescriptive. In other words, they do not impose. They do not impose something on theology. Theology is its own imposition. Theology is its own description. Theology is its own prescription, depending on how God has decided to convey those words to us. Nevertheless, okay, any attempt to be prescriptive or normative, however, will need to be carefully evaluated in light of their presuppositions. So, and remember, I'm speaking to students who are at the master's and doctoral level. You should have a grasp of these ideas. You should have had an understanding of this in your earlier education. Now, and you should have had it in your biblical education. If not, for many of you who come out of secular universities, okay, like I did many years ago, okay, you should have had some kind of a training in that kind of a thought process, so you can now connect the dots. Now, what is going to be the primary use of philosophy for us, right? So, our primary use of philosophy, okay, will be to help us to develop what? To develop and employ certain critical abilities, okay, that are of value in all areas of our endeavor, particularly our intellectual inquiry, okay, and can accordingly be utilized in doing theology. So let's look at two things. Okay? Number one, philosophy sharpens our understanding. Philosophy sharpens our understanding of concepts. This is what really made, if you look at, for example, you take Dr. R.C. Sproul, who's gone home to be with the Lord. Okay? He understood the deepest and the nuances of philosophical thought. Okay? And he was a great, great communicator as a result of it. Okay? You take Dr. John MacArthur, is another person exactly like this. Okay? You take Dr. Albert Mohler, who's another great communicator. He understands these philosophical processes. You take Dr. Stephen Lawson, okay? He's another one like this. And then just the J.I. Packer was another one like this. Okay? And so you begin to see who these people, and I want you to understand. And why is it that they can take the most complicated theological thoughts and communicate them with such simplicity? They could take the complicity out of it and turn it into simplicity because they understood the methods of philosophizing. They understood that it helped them to zone in, hone in, and clarify their understanding of concepts. And they can communicate it to a secular world as well as to the church and a secularizing church, which is what makes them great communicators. Well, whatever exact theory of meaning we adopt, just for the moment, it is essential that we ruthlessly, viciously seek to determine just what we mean by what we believe and what we say. You have to always be clarifying yourself. Now, when you're teaching a course like this, which is very, very difficult because the first time you're hearing it, you don't know, you have no clue half of what I'm saying to you. But once you study it out and you go, oh, now I know what that is. Now, how we teach in seminary, how we teach in Bible school, how we teach a course like this is very, very different the way we would communicate this in the pulpit to our congregations. Now, progress is establishing what? Progress is establishing the truth of ideas. It requires knowing precisely what we mean by them. Okay? So further, communication involves the ability to do what? To indicate what? To others just what is it that we are commending to them? What are we putting into their hands? Okay? We are never able to make clear to others what is not clear to ourselves. So this is one of the things that you see and you hear a lot as I train a lot of young preachers, okay? and sometimes they make these leaps. They go from this text to this text, and I'm sitting there going, how did you go from here to there? Right? Well, just imagine the person who has no theological quote-unquote training or doctoral training sitting in the pew, and they're listening to you, and they're going, I have no idea how he went from there to there. Okay? Then the second major area is that philosophy can help us ferret out, to vet out the presuppositions, to examine them very carefully, okay? Behind an idea or system of thought. Now, for example, if we combine two or more ideas that depend on incompatible presuppositions, okay, the result will be what? Inevitably, okay, an internal contradiction of some sort, okay, regardless of how appealing these ideas may initially appear. Not too long ago, I was listening to a young preacher, and he started in the book of Acts, okay, and he took Acts chapter 21, and he jumped into John, and just by happenstance come back to Acts 21, but he took off in another direction. It was a great message in John. The problem was that the foundation was Acts, and he took off, he never came back to it really. Well, how did you go from here to there? You should have just started out in John and just preached through John. Well, So, and this happens more often than you realize. Philosophy can resolve or help us to resolve this situation. How? By searching out and evaluating those presuppositions, okay? And we also need to be aware of what? We need to be aware that there is scarcely any such thing as neutral analysis or assessment. It doesn't exist really, okay? Every critique is made from somewhere, okay? And the validity of the perspective from which such an evaluation is made must be considered in determining how seriously the evaluation is to be taken. So, we would do well to consider what? We would do well to consider any such assertion to be the conclusion of syllogism, okay? Of syllogism, okay? And to ask what the premises of that syllogism is, okay? Sometimes we'll find that we are dealing with what we would call, it's a fancy term, ethymeme. And ethymeme, okay, E-N-T-H-Y, okay, M-E-M-E, okay, and it's an assumption, okay, it's an assumption perhaps, or perhaps a disputed or questionable one has been smuggled instead of being made explicit, okay. So we just kind of slowly slip in some assumptions, okay, and hopefully somebody doesn't catch it. And so this is the reason why not only do, we teach preachers, we teach preachers, we teach pastors how to preach a sermon, but we're going to have to also teach our congregations and our members how to listen to a sermon. Okay? So being aware of our presuppositions is going to make us more objective. Okay? And since presuppositions affect the way we perceive reality, right, we may not be able to detect the influence, okay, knowing that they are always present and presumably operative. However, it should enable us to compensate for their likely effect by going back and always examining our presuppositions, okay? This is like the problem faced by the fisherman who is spearing a fish, right? Okay? He sees a fish, and his natural reaction is to drive the spear into the water, okay, at the point where his eyes tell him, right? So he sees the fish, right, and so he drives the spear there, right, and the fish is long gone, okay? Well, right, and because his eyes tell him that's where he is. Yet his mind tells him, okay, that because of the refraction of light, right, passing from one medium, which is water, to another, which is air, the fish is not where it seems to be. So what has to happen? The fisherman must consciously, he has to thrust the spear at a point where the fish does not seem to be. Okay? So what he does, and for a lot of them, they go ahead of that. Okay? Because by the time that thing comes in there, that's where he's going to be. Look. Similarly, okay, for those people who love to go hunting, right? And I saw this when I was in Africa a lot. I would visit Africa a lot. Okay, and they're shooting at what? They're shooting at a moving object. Okay, and so they must lead it. Okay, and so they must lead it to shoot it at a point where the target will be when the bullet arrives. So what happens is that they would be slightly ahead of that moving object. Okay, because by the time the bullet hits, that's where he's going to be. Okay. So, if you take those two crazy illustrations, okay, being aware of our presuppositions, okay, means that we will consciously adjust our perception of things. Okay? So, this is true both of our general approach and our analysis of specific points. Okay? So, for example, my initial background, many years ago, okay, as a Baptist, because I was born, I became born again in a Southern Baptist church, okay, originally. My background will lead me to weigh more heavily on the arguments favoring Baptist conclusions in such areas as the doctrine of the church, for example, okay, and not all of it, but a lot of it, okay. So now, and for most of you know, I am Reformed, okay. but I am not reformed to the point where I've just accepted all the Reformation church practices either. So I must consequently require, okay, that what will seem to me as excessive evidence, okay, for conclusions that fit my biases. So I have to be aware. Okay? What are my biases? Okay? And albeit I am now a reformed believer, okay, and the teacher of the Word of God. So all of us have biases of some sort. Okay? Then let's take number 3. Philosophy, okay, can help us to trace out the implications of an idea, whatever that idea is. Okay? Now remember, philosophy does not provide the content. It's the vehicle by which we're going to present that content. But philosophy is going to help us to trace out the implications, whatever that idea is. So often, it's not possible to assess the truth of an idea in itself. So, however, it may be possible to see the implications follow from it. So what are these implications? So the implications will then often be measurable against the data, whatever data you're using, okay? So is it the Word of God? Is this the truth, okay? Is it a word study? Is it the definition of this word? Okay? What does it mean originally in this context? What does it mean originally in Hebrew, in Greek, and so forth and so forth and so forth, okay? So if the implication proves false, then the tenet or the tenets, the teaching point or the main teaching points from which it logically derives will be false as well. So if the argument is valid, okay, so now one method of determining implications is simply to what? It's simply the logical analysis of the ideas being advanced, and this is one of the features of philosophy, okay? Another is to consider what have, okay, is in actual historical occurrence been the results where similar conceptions have been held, similar ideas have been propagated. Now, so that's another tool for us. Fourth, philosophy, okay, also makes us aware of what? Of the necessity of testing truth claims. And that ultimately is what philosophy does for us, okay? When we use it as a tool rather than the content of what we're going to teach. So assertions made by themselves are not sufficient grounds for us to accept them. They must be argued. They have to be argued out so they can be heard and they can be analyzed and they can be tested against what? Objective truth. So this involves asking what kind of evidence would bear upon the truth or the falsity of the issue that's under consideration, whatever I'm preaching and teaching on, okay? And when an appropriate type and a sufficient amount of evidence would be present. Now, so do I have sufficient evidence to provide whatever my postulation happens to be? So, and there also needs to be some kind of an assessment, okay, of the logical structure of each argument to determine what? To determine whether the claimed conclusions, whatever they are, okay, really follow from the support I offer for them. Okay? So, is all my evidence supporting what my conclusion is? And a philosophy helps me to draw that, because most of our people are more philosophical than you realize. Now they don't call themselves philosophers, okay, but they do have a philosophy. They don't call themselves theologians, but they do have a theology by which they all live by. So in that type of an endeavor, okay, in that type of involved in theology specifically, one should not accept complete or exact proof. Okay, why? Probably is the best that can be hoped for. Probability is the best that can be hoped for. Okay? If you really don't understand the content. Yet one must be one should never be content. Should never be content with showing the plausibility of a conception. I think that's right. I hope that's right. I hope my audience got the drift of what I was trying to say. No, you should never be content with that. It is absolutely necessary to demonstrate what? To demonstrate, okay, that this option is preferable to the alternatives. You have to clearly demonstrate it, okay? A good friend, Dr. Fleetwood, he has another way he said, my job is to persuade you by the body of the evidence, and I'm going to teach and preach to you, okay, that this is correct. Mm-hmm. So similarly, it is criticism, okay? In criticism, it is not sufficient to find the flaws. You see, it's not sufficient just to find the flaws, okay? In a given view. Look, one must always be asking questions, okay? Okay? And so one of the questions was, what's the alternative? If this is not true, then what is the alternative? And when you look carefully at the alternative, it's going to fine-tune what you're saying to be true or not. Okay? Does the alternative have fewer difficulties than the one that I'm presenting? Okay? You know, there's a man by the name of John Bailey, Baillie, Bailey. And he tells of writing a paper in which he severely criticized a particular view. Okay? And his professor commented this way, quote unquote, every theory has its difficulties, but you have not considered whether any other theory has less difficulties than the one that you have criticized. You have to be well read. You have to understand, you know, whatever your line of thought is, look at all those thoughts all those other thoughts that are associated with the main thought that you're trying to teach. Mm-hmm. So whenever we critique we critique a view different from our own, we must use valid objective criteria. This is why analytical philosophy forces us to do. Right? There would seem to be two types. Okay, the criteria that views that a view sets for itself, right? And the criteria that all such views must meet, which is a universal criteria, right? Now, you need to understand that it's not damaging, okay? It's not damaging criticism to the point, okay, to point out something, okay? In effect, a difference between our view and another position. No. Much criticism virtually consists of the charge that A is different from B, right? How typically how this works. Okay? But such a complaint is inconsequential. Unless one has already established that B is the correct view and A claims to be an instance of B. You go, oh, brother, what did you just say? Well, look, for example, look, many years ago when I would do my debates, I would do my theological debates in a mosque in Pakistan, right? And this was very typical. So what I had to do, I had to read and I had to study the Quran. I had to understand what the perspective was and exactly how they were presenting their version of God. Well, I had done that already with my Bible, okay? So I had to read and understand that. So I found myself in a situation where we had to look at A and B. Okay? So I had to really understand what B was in order to properly postulate, form, present what my A position was. Okay? So to draw an illustration from a completely different realm, okay, as we come to a close in this particular session, is that suppose that a football team stresses offense. Okay? Now, for all you guys who love sports, okay, and you understand football, you'll understand what I'm talking about. But if a team wins a game by a score of, let's say, and I'm gonna use American football as an example, okay, by a score of 40-35. Just as I come to a close here, just follow this out, okay? Because I already told you that it's a complicated course, it's a boring course. And it's an arduous course to the mind, okay? Which is why most of the students who deal with this particular subject, they listen through the teaching several times and they go, oh, now I get it, okay? So I don't expect you to get it the first time, and I get that. Okay? But let's do it this way. So let's say a team wins a game by the score of 40-35, okay? It would not be a valid criticism to point out the poor quality of its defense. Okay? However, on the other hand, okay? On the other hand, if the team wins a game by a score of 7-6, it would be appropriate to point out its low scoring, since the team has not met its own criterion of a well-played game. And if a team scores 49 points, but it gives up 52 points, okay, it is vulnerable to criticism on the basis of a universal criteria, and we see this all the time. Since presumably all teams, regardless of their style of play, intend to have more points at the end of the game than they do of their opposition. And so one side, let's say the score is 49-52, okay? And people say, well, there was obviously no defense in this game. It was all offense. When you see both sides, okay? 49-52, man, that's a lot of points on both ends, okay? But then the individual teams, you would see, well, you definitely had offense, but you had no defense. You had offense, so that they talked to the team who has 49 points, they lost the game. You had a lot of offense, but you didn't have any defense. And then the team has got 52 points, okay, and you had a lot of offense, okay, and your defense was weak. So you're gonna see this. So more is going to be said about this, okay, in terms of our criteria for evaluating propositions, narratives, truths, systems, okay, when we get into this area when we're going to talk about what's called the religious language, how we convey ideas, how we talk about them, what are the words that we use, okay. So at this point, it's just going to be sufficient to point out that the criteria generally utilized, okay, are eternal consistency and coherence of ideas or sets of ideas, and their ability to describe accurately the account for all of the relevant factual data that we're going to be using. And so that's what we're going to be engaging in, okay, as we get into as we go down the line, and we'll be looking at the religious language. And so in our next section, we're going to be dealing with the method of theology. The method of theology. Sufficient to say for right now, suffice to say. Now we're going to bring this section to a close, and then we're going to pick up in our next section the method of theology. It's toward the end you're going to see where all this makes sense. And as you read your favorite authors, as you follow your favorite theologians, as you follow your favorite teachers and preachers of the Word of God, you're going to begin to hear and see what their philosophical background is, and it's going to begin to come out. You're going to begin to see it in ways you never saw it before.